Wherever you want. We're not messing with it. Yeah, so don't know get blasted. We're not going to use the right height to not get blasted. Yeah,
I'll go over his head.
Just go over his head. Knock his boot off.
I think you can.
You can't feel the drum.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to do a small display. We'll be firing the muskets. Before we do, I'll explain who we are and what we're doing and what's the difference. The gentleman over here to my right, representing the 68th Durham Light Infantry from the Napoleonic Wars. Just over 200 years ago, we were fighting the French. Napoleon and his friends. 68, like many other British regiments, were sent abroad. They fought them, the French that is, in Spain and Portugal. The French army was a lot bigger than the British army, so back home lots of volunteers were raised. And I represent one of the many volunteer corps that were raised, nearly 500,000 men. The second Duke of Northumberland, he was a general in the British Army, and he raised a body of 1,500 troops. So we call them the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, because they were all tenants. Now, the standard way of fighting back then was in lines and columns, such as the men are standing now. If you can imagine a row of about 300 men, 2 ranks deep, they would move around the battlefield in solid lines. These men, however, are light infantry. They were trained to fight in lines, but also as light infantry. The difference was the men would fight in pairs. They would be spread out. The advantage was they could take advantage of the terrain. They could hide in ditches, behind hedges, trees, etc., and snipe at the enemy. The Percy Tenantry, who I represent, were trained in a very similar way. One of the big differences, however, you might have noticed, is the uniform. The British Army were dressed in red. The Percy Tenantry were dressed in green. Because the Duke had served during the American War of Independence, he was at the very first battle at Lexington when the Americans weren't fighting fair. They weren't in lines and columns. The conventional way of fighting, they were hiding behind walls and hedges and buildings, taking pot shots at the British, inflicting lots of casualties. The Duke knew if a French army landed on the coast here, he wouldn't have enough men to stop them. So he trained his men similar to the Americans. He taught them guerrilla tactics. He clothed them in green. He taught them to conceal themselves, never to shoot at the enemy unless you're sure you're going to hit your man. So if I was hiding in a wood, I'd rather be wearing this than the red. At the time, the British Army had 2 rifle regiments and they were dressed in green. But for most troops, it was still the red. Now what we're going to do is do a little bit of a display. All the British troops, as I said, were taught to fight in line, and they had to learn lots and lots of drill. We're just going to go through a little bit, and then we'll go through the firing procedure, and we'll actually fire these muskets. Squat. Turn shut. Shoulder. Arms. Advance. Arms. Train.